Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
Welcome, folks, to this episode of our Troubleshooting Herd Health Issues on Your Dairy. I'm Kathy Barrett with Cornell's Pro Dairy program, and I have with me Dr. Julio Giordano, who is a veterinarian and PhD who does research and is on faculty at Cornell University in this whole area of reproductive management. So for this episode, that's what we're going to be focusing on, heifer reproductive management. If you've been listening to this series, you know that we've already talked about calves and transition for weaning, as well as disease and growth for our breeding age heifers. But today's focus for this episode is purely on the reproductive program. So Julio, thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And we know you do a lot of work in this area and with farmers as well as research and students. So I kind of wanted to just get your opinion on what the overall goals a farm should shoot for or think about for their heifer reproduction program.
Great, Kathy. Hello to you and everybody who will listen to the podcast. It's my great pleasure to participate, and thanks for inviting me. So when thinking about the heifer enterprise, I always keep in mind the relevance of the economics of the heifer enterprise for the whole dairy operation. We know that the heifer enterprise is one of the main contributors to the cost of producing milk in dairy farms. And I tend to think about how we can reduce the cost of the heifer enterprise through reproductive management. The one factor, or the one thing with which reproductive management can contribute the most to reduce the cost of the heifer enterprise or rearing heifers is by reducing the number of non-productive days or the number of non-lactating days, which can be done through reducing days to pregnancy after heifers become eligible to become pregnant. So once that the farm decides that it's a good time to get those heifers pregnant, either based on their size, their weight, or their age, what can we do from a management perspective to minimize the days that these heifers are not pregnant or open? And the one thing that is interesting that I would like people to think about, when you think about the entire non-lactating or non-productive period of a dairy cow and the different phases that a baby calf goes through until she calves for the first time, the breeding period is probably the period at which we have the most opportunity to shorten, right? So there's not much that we can do to shorten the liquid phase before weaning. There's not a whole lot that we can do to reduce the period of post-weaning and pre-breeding, especially if we want them to grow at the proper rate so they have a good size before breeding. And of course, we cannot do anything to shorten gestation or how many days they are going to be pregnant before they calve. So the golden opportunity is with the breeding period. How many days are going to pass from the day that the farm decides that a heifer is ready to become pregnant and she actually becomes pregnant? And the faster a heifer gets pregnant after she becomes eligible, the lower the rearing cost, which everybody thinks about and understands really well. So the total cost of raising a heifer all the way to lactation. But there's also another hidden cost that probably we don't think about a lot, that is the opportunity cost of delayed lactation. Or basically, when you think about the number of days that dairy cow is going to be productive through her life, right? So how can we hasten or make them go faster to lactation. So per their entire productive life, they spend more time generating revenue than just cost. So those are the things that I think about: the opportunity to reduce rearing costs, reduce the opportunity cost of delayed lactation, and through that, of course, reduce the overall impact of rearing heifers or the heifer enterprise. And just, Kathy, the one thing that I find very interesting, as we work a lot with both lactating cows and non-lactating heifer economics, and how repro affects the economics of heifers and cows, it's quite interesting to me how we have seen through our research the tremendous opportunity that we have with heifers versus cows. I always like to tell people that the industry in general has done a fantastic job improving repro performance of the lactating cows. And we have forgotten in some cases about heifers and the tremendous opportunity, the economic opportunity that we have in heifers. Because even though open days are costly in lactating cows, they are at least making milk and generating some revenue. Heifers generate no revenue. It's zero revenue and it's all cost. So the opportunity, the economic value of getting heifer pregnant, it's pretty significant. And in many cases, more significant or substantial as compared to lactating cows.
So Julio, those are really interesting points. So when you get a call from a farm asking you how to evaluate their program, what is the process you go through?
That's a really good question. And before I get going, I want to make sure that you understand that I do it from the perspective of a consultant or somebody who is not working every day with heifers or with the herd, right? So my perspective is a little bit different. However, a lot of the things that I do, I think that they could be also used, or people at the farm or consultants that work with the farm on a regular basis could also use as part of their approach to evaluate repro. So as I said, to me, the most critical metric or factor is days to pregnancy. So when do heifers become pregnant after they become eligible to get pregnant? So it is basically time to pregnancy. We have different ways of measuring time to pregnancy in heifers. So we could measure time to pregnancy as days open after they became eligible to become pregnant. We could measure it with pregnancy rates. My preference is to measure it as pregnancy rate. And in particular, with the 21-day pregnancy rate, which is an interesting metric because it offers, in a way, a lot of information about what is happening with heifers. So the way that I approach evaluating heifer performance, or the performance of the reproductive management program, it's starting from what I consider to be the ultimate outcome of interest, and then going down through the different components that make up and affect that outcome of interest. I like to think about the process that I follow as decomposing the pieces or the parts of a pyramid, where at the top of the pyramid, we have the 21-day pregnancy rate, which is going to affect the speed or rate at which heifers become pregnant. So the 21-day pregnancy rate is affected by two main factors or two main components. One is the speed or rate at which heifers are inseminated. The other one is the conception rate. Most of us talk about it in the industry, also known as conception risk or pregnancy spare. It's all the same, okay? And I'll refer to it from now on as conception rate. And what it tells us is about how effective we are at getting a heifer or any female pregnant after it was inseminated. So those are the two main components that make up the 21-day pregnancy rate, and look at those first. So the one thing that is interesting too is that we usually think about troubleshooting, right? But this is important not only for farms that are troubleshooting what they perceive to be a problem with reproductive performance, but also for farms that are doing well. It's important to know what things are going well so they continue to be done well, or they could also be even improved further. So we're going to look at the 21-day pregnancy rate, and then if we decide based on the objectives of the farm that things are not going as well as expected, or if they are going as expected, we're going to look at these two other factors, the 21-day service rate and the conception rate. And these two factors, again, they tell us about two different things. One is the speed at which heifers are being inseminated, and the other one is how effective they are becoming pregnant. So if the 21-day service rate is low, that could be a problem with the heat detection program and or the estrus or ovulation synchronization program. If the farm uses a program with hormones to synchronize estrus and or ovulation, so any type of OVSYN program or co-sync program, the problem may be with when those programs and how those programs are being implemented. So in order to determine if those are the problems, what I like to do is to lay out the program that the farm is using and have a better understanding of what are the procedures that the farm is implementing. So if it is a potential problem with the heat detection program, the things that I would like to know is how it's being done. And this is one of the tricky areas for heifers. Commonly, and unfortunately, we have dairies that don't have a well-established protocol to conduct estrus detection in a way that heifers are detected in estrus efficiently. So some of the general questions with heat detection would be, who is doing it, how is doing it, and how frequently is doing it. So those are, in my opinion, some of the critical questions. And of course, we want trained personnel conducting estrus detection, so people that know, and this may seem like a basic issue, right? But it may not be in some cases. And, you know, I have come across farms that I've been working with that personnel sent to do heat detection, they truly don't know. And what is interesting is how in some cases, people who are not previously trained, they may be afraid of acknowledging that they don't know and maybe afraid of asking questions. So again, trained personnel, and if people are not trained or have the skill from doing it before, to make sure that people know what they are doing. So who is doing it? What's the level of training from personnel? And then to the question of how it's being done and how often it's being done. So we have many options for heat detection, as everybody knows, from all the way from the oldest traditional visual observation through tail pain, tail chalk, to today, you know, the who may be a computer, right? A sensor system. We have automated estrus detection systems, which in fact is a great question. I mean, is there any sort of aid or technology that is being used for estrus detection? So how is that aid or technology being used? And we could talk about that for a long time, of course, in terms of aids and technology for detection of estrus. And then the frequency would also be dependent upon the protocol that is set. But if it is going to be the old visual observation, at least do it for enough time that we get the opportunity to see heifers in the sexually active group interact, make sure that we detect those ones that are in heat. So a certain amount of time, a minimum amount of time that will probably depend on the size of the heifer pen, or basically how many animals we have, and whether the person can see it all at once or has to go through different pens. It varies a lot farm by farm. And then as far as protocols for synchronization of estrus and ovulation, there are a lot of them. There's a lot of variants of different protocols. It's, as a rule of thumb, of generally what we want to do is use programs or protocols that help put semen on heifers sooner. And that can be through the use of prostaglandins to promote estrus expression, or synchronization of ovulation with off-sync or co-sync like protocols that allow us to use time AI. And those protocols, as you know, could be used for first breeding only, but also for second and subsequent services. And actually, an interesting thing to think about is, and sometimes this is the problem, that we focus a lot on the first breeding and we don't think a lot about second and subsequent breeding. So having a good program to rebreed non-pregnant heifers. So that would be one thing that would for sure look at. I mean, do they have a good program to catch heifers in heat after first breeding? And for those that are not caught in heat, is there pregnancy testing at some point after the previous insemination? Is that done early enough? And for the ones that are found open, what do we do with them? Is there any action that will help reduce days to reinsemination? Are we resynchronizing them, or are we just calling them open and letting them go and hope that they show a heat? But it may turn out that they don't. So having a systematic and consistent program to manage second and subsequent breedings. In summary, when looking at the 21-day service rate, we have to focus on how the program for heat detection or time AI affect the speed or rate at which heifers are inseminated once that they are eligible. The other factor is the conception rate. And the conception rate is affected by some of the same factors that we talked about for the service rate. Of course, the method and the way that heat detection are done are important. It's a little more important, the accuracy of heat detection, than the efficiency when we are thinking about conception rate, but it's also important. And certainly what type of protocol or treatments we are using to synchronize estrus and or ovulation, which can also drive the conception rate quite a bit. But among the factors to think about when thinking about conception rate, some of the critical ones are insemination. So how are heifers being inseminated? And the type of questions would be very similar than the type of questions we ask for heat detection. So who is doing it? How is doing it? And to an extent, when it's being done. And in this case, we can think a little more, when is it done, for example, in relationship to estrus detection, so hours after a heifer is detected in estrus, or timing in relationship to hormonal treatments for synchronization of ovulation. So the AI technician certainly has a lot of influence on the success of inseminations. And therefore, we always have to think about technicians, and it's always important to look at the outcome for different technicians if there's more than one, or the sole technician if there is just one. We may want to think as well about the semen being used, and what is important, especially with heifers today, is to recognize what are some of the differences due to the type of semen that is being used, in particular because of the widespread of sex semen used in heifers. It's important to recognize that there is still a gap between sex semen and conventional semen. sex semen still leads to reduced fertility as compared to conventional semen. That gap has been reduced in recent years, and I'm very hopeful that in a few more years there will be no such a gap, but there's still a gap, and it continues to be in the 80 to 90, in the best cases, 90% range of what we observe with conventional semen. Again, the point is recognize that with sex semen, we expect to have reduced fertility than with conventional semen. Of course, it depends too on whether just first breeding or second and subsequent breedings, heifers are being inseminated with sex semen, but just knowing and recognizing that difference is important. As I just mentioned, it's also important to look at breeding number. In general, with heifers, there tends to be a difference by breeding number, whereby the first breeding tends to be the most fertile. So that's where we observe the highest conception rate, and then it will drop progressively as heifers receive multiple breedings. And this has to do a little bit with just the population, how the population of heifers shifts. As we breed more, the most fertile ones tend to become pregnant at first breeding, and then we are dealing with a population of less fertile heifers, at least compared to the original population, and that explains the drop in fertility as they receive more breedings. Those are some of the critical factors that are not as heifer related, but of course, we can never forget about what makes a heifer more or less fertile, which of course are her nutritional status. So are heifers well fed? Are they well fed now? And have they been well fed up to the point that we want to breed them? As we learn more and more about the medium and short-term consequences of nutritional management on performance of dairy cows, and this is not only for milk production and health, but also for reproduction, which in fact, it being affected by so many factors, being such a multifactorial outcome, it's very important to know or figure out if there were some problems in the past. Just in general, look at nutritional management, the overall health status of heifers, ensure that they are being kept as healthy as possible. Environmental conditions are also very important. The type of facilities in which they are housed, in particular, if they are in confinement, if they are in barns, the type of barns and stocking densities and access to feed and water and resting space. It is interesting that, as everybody probably knows, that heifers can deal with a lot of less than ideal environmental conditions. You know, in general, heifers, when they are well fed and in relatively decent facilities and environmental conditions, they are pretty good at showing heats, and they are pretty good at getting pregnant. So in general, conditions have to be quite unfavorable, quite severe, at least in my experience, as to affect their ability to show heats and to become pregnant once that they are inseminated. So in summary, we went through, again, the top of the pyramid with the outcome that tells us about how all these factors that we talked about are going. So are we doing things well or not so well? So the pregnancy rate will, in a way, be our metric to figure out how things are going. And then if things are not going that well, we start decomposing the different factors that are implicated on the speed or rate at which heifers become pregnant. And depending on what we observe, we are going to steer in one direction versus the other. In many cases, we want to check boxes and say, you know, this is not a problem. We'll keep going in this other direction. I have not emphasized too much the fact that we usually do this with data. First, having data, and second, having good quality data is relevant and it's very, very important. It's really hard to evaluate anything without data. If we do not have data, maybe it's a good opportunity as an operation to decide to start collecting data so we know where we are and we know where we want to go and how do we get there. Lack of data may just be an opportunity to change course and start collecting data. That is absolutely critical. The one last thing that I would like to mention, and this is being a little bit more specific for dairies that do have data, is that you have to always keep in mind, this is particularly important when looking at the 21-day pregnancy rate, of what is the criteria used to determine that a heifer is eligible to become pregnant. So when do we start breeding heifers? That's very, very important because it can affect the way that data looks like, in particular for the 21-day pregnancy rate. And what I'm talking about here is the fact that many dairies use age. They will use age as the main criteria to decide when heifers are going to start being bred. They're going to become eligible for pregnancy. And when that is the case, in general, it's not too problematic when calculating the 21-day pregnancy rate, because if the dairy truly respects age as a criteria, we start counting heifers as eligible at the same age. However, as dairies start using more and more, or they may be already using other criteria, such as body weight or a certain size, or even a combination of age, weight, and size, or weight and size. And if there are differences, as you would expect that there are differences in growth rates, and therefore the days of age at which heifers are truly eligible to become pregnant, right? So whenever they hit the mark, so they start being bred. And that mark is at a different age. So there may be a heifer that 12 months of age is ready. And let's talk about extremes. And there's another one in the same group or herd that is ready at 14 months. When we calculate some of these metrics, in particular the 21-day pregnancy rate, the computer software will look at all of them with only one age as cut off. So then when we run that calculation, it's going to be biased by the fact that we are not deciding based on age, but in other criteria. So there are some ways to deal with that. In some of the popular dairy herd management softwares, basically set up the software so that heifers are counted as eligible when they truly become eligible. It's not done by age, but rather by these criteria that is going to be evaluated on an individual heifer case. And therefore, the metric, the 21-day pregnancy rate, is adjusted. I cannot emphasize enough that, for heifers that actually use something other than age, because the differences that it causes in 21-day pregnancy rate can be dramatic. I'm talking about differences in the range of 5 to 15 percentage points. So it is large enough of a difference that it could make a dairy think that they have a problem when they don't have it, or think that things are going really well when they are not. It's a very, very common issue.
Julio, that was an excellent overview. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us. And folks, join us again next week when we start talking about troubleshooting the calving process.
Thanks for listening to this Herd Health Troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the ProDairy website, along with many other resources.